Have you ever wondered what this symbol is that we keep seeing all across the One Piece storyline? From Alabasta to Skypiea to the moon to Fishman Island to the Kazuki crest and even Kuma's cross, we see it over and over again. What if I told you that this symbol right here is actually the D-Clan crest? And to be more specific, it is the sun being revolved around by 8 different planets. But the One Piece world doesn't know this. Just look at Professor Clover's laboratory. He has planets revolving around the Earth, not the sun. And this is symbolism to how Imu erased the sun, extinguishing the light that was known as sun god Nika. This forced the One Piece planet into a geocentric solar system model, not the correct layout of a heliocentric model. Now, if you take the D-Clan crest and you grab a legendary artifact from Hinduism called the Navaratna and you place them on top of each other, you come to find out that this is the exact inspiration that Oda is using. Why? Because the dead center of it is the mineral type known as a ruby, symbolizing the center of the solar system, the sun, Monkey D. Luffy, which is exactly why in the Navaratna, it specifically labels Saturn as the god of sapphire stones. Saint Saturn of the Gorosei is to blame for Ginny and Bonnie's sapphire scale disease. Today you are going to learn the religious inspiration for One Piece that answers everything. But before we jump into the theory, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more One Piece theory videos on the brand new Evil channel. And before we can jump into this theory video, I have to give a huge shout out to a TikTok user known as Dawn of Ascension. She's an upcoming creator with lots of great takes and very knowledgeable when it comes to real world conspiracies and religions. Please go drop her a follow over there on TikTok. She was a massive help for today's video. Now to start this off, we recently saw Kuma inside of his church on Sorbet Kingdom praying to a special emblem, which is a cross with a certain circular design in the center of it. Now if you do take a closer look at the center of the cross, you notice that the symbol there is very reminiscent of symbols that we've seen around the One Piece storyline. This symbol that I'm referring to looks like a big circle with 8 little ones surrounding it, but for now, for simplicity purposes, let's just call it the D-Clan crest. It's the same symbol that we see on the flag of Alabasta, with the only difference being 8 teardrops instead of 8 regular circles. It's even similar to the Skypiea symbol we saw in a cover story, with the difference being Chinese text in the center saying God, matching the god of our solar system, the sun and the ruby. And it's also similar to the Skypiea symbol that we've seen on Wiper's left arm, with the difference being 8 lines instead of 8 circles coming from the center. And it's also similar to the Fishman Island symbol, which we see on King Neptune's right arm, with the only difference being 8 teardrops instead of circles, and something that looks like a question mark in the dead center. And it's even similar to what we've seen in NL's cover story on the moon in the hieroglyphics, with the only difference being 8 swirls instead of 8 circles revolving around the center. And finally, we see it in the Kazuki clan crest, which isn't much different from the D-Clan crest, other than the fact that it's sitting on some type of bird known as a peacock. With these 4 main kingdoms of Alabasta, Skypiea, Fishman Island, and Wano having something to do with the D-Clan crest, we have to come to wonder, like, does this mean something? Yes, it does mean something. It's basically alluding to the idea that these 4 major kingdoms are offspring or descendants of the D-Clan. If this is true, then it would explain why they utilized the D-Clan crest on their flags in the first place, and it would explain why they all have ties to Joy Boy or Sun God Nika in one way or another. And now this is where we're gonna really turn up the heat, because I'm arguing that the center of the D-Clan crest is basically symbolism of the sun or sun god Nika. Now let's take a moment to shift our focus to the Gorosei and their role in the One Piece story to kind of make sense of this all. Well, we learned in chapter 1086 that Oda decided to name the members of the Gorosei after planets in our solar system, with one example of Gorosei Gandhi being named after Venus. Now this naming scheme of planets isn't only limited to the Gorosei, because this logic can also be applied to the ancient weapons of One Piece. Firstly, we know that there's an ancient weapon named Poseidon who lives in Fishman Island, which is just another name for the planet of Neptune. Secondly, we know that there's an ancient weapon named Pluton that's said to slumber underneath the land of Wano, which is just another name for Pluto. And thirdly, there's an ancient weapon named Uranus, which is still a huge mystery to this day, and it's named after the planet of Uranus in our solar system. After reflecting on the names of the Gorosei members and ancient weapons, it's abundantly clear that Oda's using a heavy celestial theme in his story. And this would even extend to Luffy, since he ate the sun god Nika devil fruit in the first place. And this is way deeper than what you realize, and it's going to play into the biggest themes in the One Piece storyline. If we turn our attention to Robin's backstory, we know she grew up with one of the most goated theorists of all time, Professor Clover. But in his laboratory, he had a solar system model that allowed us to see what the One Piece universe looks like. It features the Earth, a few planets, and moons that revolve around said planets. But the most important detail of Professor Clover's solar system model is that we can see it has a layout known as the geocentric model. Now the word geocentric is two different words combined into one, so let's take a moment to break it down to kind of understand what it means. First, the word geo comes from the word earth, and second, the word centric comes from the word center. So geocentric means earth in the center. So if we jump back to Clover's solar system model, it's pretty clear that they think the other planets in their world revolve around earth, hence a geocentric model. Which, by the way, we know that the One Piece planet that Luffy lives on is Earth, because during the Skypiea arc, Gonfall and Enel referred to the moon as Fairyverth because of the mystical attributes of outer space. But yet when they were talking about the soil from the blue planet, they called it Verth, not Fairyverth. This proves that the One Piece planet does in fact come from the idea of Earth. Now, all this science and all of this astronomy and geocentric, heliocentric stuff might seem a bit daunting, but I promise that it is very crucial to the One Piece overarching plotline, and we're going to make sense of it. So let's take a moment to shift our focus to the real world, because we know that centuries ago, philosophers and scientists thought that we lived in a geocentric solar system. And yeah, there were a bunch of people that believed the geocentric model was wrong, but when they called it out, they were made fun of and dismissed by people who thought they were insane. So it took an astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus to prove that the world we live in is not a geocentric model, but a heliocentric model. Again, geocentric means Earth in the center. So let's break down the term heliocentric to get a better understanding of what that means. First, the word helio comes from the word sun, and then obviously second, the word centric comes from the word center. So heliocentric means sun in the center. Now that we have all of this astronomy jargon out of the way, let's actually apply it to the One Piece story, because that's kind of what this video is about. Professor Clover's laboratory featuring the geocentric model means that the One Piece world is mistaken, just like how our real world was mistaken. The correct layout that Professor Clover should be using is the heliocentric model, just like how we do in the real world. And trust me, all of this is purely intentional by Oda. He's trying to sneak this right past our eyes and just trying to have us think like, oh, well, what if the One Piece world is just built different? Professor Clover not using the heliocentric model is symbolism for sun god Nika and how his existence was erased, thus creating a geocentric world. Like, just think about it. During the Reverie, we watched the Gorosei approach Imu, and they asked him what the next light should be extinguished should be. So in One Piece and the real world, the sun is the ultimate light bearer. Characters like Luffy and sun god Nika act as the ultimate light bringers and dawn bringers that must be extinguished. So basically, Imu eliminated the sun, which would be sun god Nika. This ended up tricking the world into a geocentric type of world model instead of a heliocentric type of world model. So with the power of science and the power of astronomy, we can have a better understanding of the larger themes in the One Piece story, kind of like the sun re-emerging from the darkness. Consequently, it plays into the celestial elements we see in the Gorosei and ancient weapons, since they are all named after planets in our solar system. And finally, it plays into the D-Clan crest, as we mentioned earlier, because if you look very closely, it's the sun with 8 planets orbiting it. It's actually so insane how sneaky and how clever Oda is, sneaking this right past our eyes. And that's why you can see that all of these celestial themes and all of these space elements we see in One Piece have a deeper meaning. This becomes extremely obvious when we observe the Alabasta flag. It's called the sun sign, with the sun in the center of it. This means that Alabasta, whom we know didn't join the world government to live in Marijua, chose to use the heliocentric model, not the geocentric model. If the One Piece world really understood the significance and meaning behind sun god Nika, then they would essentially be leaving behind the geocentric world model and be moving into the heliocentric world model. But more importantly, they would understand that sun god Nika is the true ruler of the world, but not in an evil dictator type of way that we see from Imu. I would argue that Imu quite literally took the D-Clan crest and broke it down to create the world government symbol that we see all around the story. And it's all super symbolic of where the One Piece planet is currently at in terms of intelligence to where they're going to be towards the end of the story. But shifting our focus back to sun god Nika for a second, it's pretty apparent that the sun is significant in many different religions, one example being Hinduism. And the reason why I'm pinpointing Hinduism specifically is because of our favorite main character, Luffy. Longtime fans know what I'm about to say. Luffy is based on the legendary Hindu monkey god named Hanumanji. I've explained this a million times across 20 videos, but the short answer is that Luffy is a monkey who ate the sun thinking it was a fruit, just like Hanumanji, which was the sun god Nika devil fruit. Then in Wano, Luffy used an attack that ended up defeating Kaido, and it was called Bajrang Gun. Bajrang is another name for the Hindu monkey god Hanumanji. And finally, the spiritual father of Hanumanji is a deity named Vayu, and Vayu is known as being the Lord of the Winds. This obviously connects to the father of Luffy, Monkey D. Dragon, which we've seen around wind elements in the story over and over again. Again, I've delved into this topic in so many videos and my longtime fans are tired of hearing it, so new fans, just trust me on this one, okay? But with Luffy and Dragon having heavy ties to Hinduism, I think that Hinduism's gonna go a lot further than just them when it comes to the One Piece storyline. If we turn our attention to the Hindu universe, it is said that the sun is considered the chief and ruler, acting as the true heavenly body of the universe. Comparing that Hinduism lore to One Piece makes perfect sense to me because we know that sun god Nika is the true chief and ruler, not false gods like Emu. And just a warning, all of this science, astronomy, and religion talk is just the intro to this video. Like, we're literally gonna jump 100 times deeper. So if we circle back to Hinduism, the most popular religion in areas like India, we could find important artifacts to the culture like the Navaratna. The Navaratna is a layout of the sun with its respective planets, which is pretty much the same thing as our actual scientific solar system. The crazy part though is each planet on the diagram essentially connects to a specific mineral, day, and direction. Like, there's a lot of depth and meaning with Hinduism's Navaratna. The overall design of the Navaratna looks just like a compass, with the dead center being a ruby mineral, symbolizing the sun in the center of our universe. So if we consider the Navaratna from Hinduism, it's pretty clear that Oda's using it for inspiration as far as the overarching storyline and like main themes of One Piece goes. But more importantly, the Navaratna is a direct reference to something huge we were talking about earlier. If we revisit the D-Clan crest, we can see that Hinduism's Navaratna is the same layout and design. It's like 1-to-1. You can place them on top of each other and they will line up. You can even look at other regions of the world like Japan to see even more evidence that the D-Clan crest is taking inspiration from our solar system. Because if we look at the Japanese Moon Koyotomoe, it basically translates to 9-star swirls, which looks exactly like the Navaratna and the D-Clan crest. The Kuyo-Komon is also literally said to symbolize the Navaratna, with the 9 astronomical objects in Hindu astrology serving as inspiration to it. The Kuyo-Komon is also believed to protect people against evils, and the Kuyo-Komon has been used by many samurai and warlords throughout history. This essentially proves what we were saying earlier. The D-Clan crest and all of these symbols we see in major One Piece kingdoms is based on the sun, with 8 planets revolving around it. With that being understood, let's shift our focus back to the Navaratna to see what else we could discover. Because if we dive a little bit deeper, we can see that each planet correlates to a certain mineral, so we should analyze it to see if it explains anything in the One Piece story. If we start with the planet of Saturn on the Navaratna, we can see that it lines up perfectly with the mineral known as the sapphire. In this case, let's observe Saint Saturn in One Piece, who appears to be the old bearded Gorosei that's currently on Egghead Island fighting Luffy. Since his name perfectly aligns with the specific planet we're observing, we should connect some dots between him and sapphire minerals to make sense of this all. Well, we know in chapter 1098, it was revealed that Ginny was captured by the celestial dragons, and she was even forced to become the wife of one. After that was shown, we then learned that Ginny also caught a disease called the sapphire scales, which is taking inspiration from a very specific mineral, the sapphire. Now, since Ginny never had the disease until she was captured by celestial dragons, and her daughter Bonnie was born with it, we can safely assume that the celestial dragons infected Ginny with the disease. And since Saint Saturn aligns with the sapphire mineral in the Navaratna, we could create a simple connection between Saturn and Ginny, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, it's not only Hinduism, it's not only the Navaratna that has connections between Saturn and sapphires. Like, we could dive a little bit deeper and look through other lenses in our real world to find more connections, like basic astrology. And big shout out to DJ Slowmo on Twitter for this detail, because he shared it with me in the first place. In basic astrology, it is said that the blue sapphire stone is ruled by Lord Saturn. So yet again, this is another connection between the Gorosei because of Saint Saturn and the sapphire scales disease. It's not only Hinduism that ties the two things together. And to really drive home the idea that Saint Saturn is connected to the sapphire scales disease, let's take a look at the actual inspiration to Saint Saturn in the first place. In chapter 1094, we finally had Saturn's true monster form revealed to us after hundreds of chapters of build-up. Analyzing it, it appears to be that of a Japanese yokai, which is basically demons and monsters in the culture of Japan. But to be more specific, it's pretty clear that Saturn's based on a yokai called the Ushi Oni, which can be broken down into 2 different words. The word Ushi basically means bull or cattle, and the word Oni means demon or ogre, so basically bull demon. Now this does make sense since both Saturn and the Ushi-Oni have a bull for a face and they're pretty demonic in their overall appearance. But let's observe the lore of the Ushi-Oni because it holds the final key that we need for the sapphire scales disease. It is said in the mythology of the Ushi-Oni that it can infect humans with an incurable disease that eventually leads to death. And in Japan's culture, there were examples of the Ushi-Oni infecting kings and their wives with diseases that ended up killing them. We could connect this to the sapphire scale disease because Ginny told Kuma that her disease was incurable, and she also ended up dying from it. And doctors also told Kuma that Bonnie's disease is incurable, which almost had Bonnie dead by the age of 10 years old. A really sad situation, honestly. But with that being said, it should be abundantly clear that Saturn's interconnected to sapphire scales, the sapphire scale disease, and Ginny. And I'm sure a lot of you guys watching this video right now are probably thinking about Goldie Roger because he too did have an incurable disease. But if you ask me, I think it's way more probable that Saturn's connected to the sapphire scales disease and not Roger's disease. Just let me explain real quick. As we saw in episode 966, Roger was already coughing up blood from his disease and he had no sapphire scales on him whatsoever. And if you're a fan of the anime, you would know that Roger's execution was reanimated from scratch so many times, and none of them ever showed sapphire scales on Roger's face. So it makes sense to me that Roger's disease is something totally different, possibly a disease from the other Gorosei members, with it being named after a different mineral. The funniest part about this though is, again, Saturn's connected to the sapphire scales, but the Navaratna basically implies that the other Gorosei members might give off incurable diseases that are tied to minerals. What's funny about that is because look at Roger and his crew. Think about this for a second. Copper Gabon, Silver Rayleigh, Gold Roger. Oda's doing some mastermind stuff in the background that's not entirely clear right now. And it's so crazy to me that Oda will have all of these small things that seem so small and trivial but end up playing a bigger role than we could ever imagine. But okay, sorry, we got a little bit off topic there. But bouncing back to the Navaratna, I do actually want to name off each mineral for all of the celestial bodies. That way you guys can cook up theories about more Gorosei incurable diseases. Based on the Navaratna, it is said that Jupiter uses the topaz, Mercury uses the emerald, Saturn uses the sapphire, Venus uses the diamond, Mars uses the coral, the Earth's moon uses the pearl, and the sun uses the ruby. Now, Luffy being the sun god, thus lining up with the ruby, makes a lot of sense when we observe the actual One Piece manga, since there are hints about it all over the place. For one, we know that on Onigashima's rooftop, Luffy began by using an attack called Red Rock, which on surface level might seem like a reference to a bird. But I would argue that it's actually a double entendre, because it's pretty obvious and understood that a ruby is quite literally a red rock. Additionally, we have cover stories and cover pages that foreshadow a lot in One Piece, like the fact that Oda gave the Straw Hats samurai costumes and pretty much spoiled Momonosuke hundreds of chapters in advance. With that being the case, on the cover of Weekly Shonen Jump issue 25, Oda drew Luffy with a crown that features not only the minerals of the Navaratna, but also the ruby nearly in the center. And I'm very sure that there's like way more foreshadowing of Luffy being connected to the ruby, so if you guys know any more, comment down below and I'll heart and reply to the comments. And now that we got all of the science, astronomy, heliocentric, geocentric, Navaratna, blah blah blah, all of this stuff out of the way, I do want to dive a little bit deeper into religious inspiration for the One Piece story. Because the 8 celestial bodies that revolve around the sun and that are used in the D-Clan crest also play into something else huge in the plot. The pentagram, which is seen repeatedly in One Piece, mostly having some type of connection to the world government every time we see it. First, we see it in the Room of Authority, which is where the Gorosei typically have their discussions about the One Piece world and what they think about it. Second, we saw it on Namakura Island when Brook fell on the dead center of it and was labeled as Satan by the residents of the island. And finally, we saw it when Saturn finally landed on Egghead and began fighting the Straw Hat Pirates. With the constant use of devil fruits, pentagrams, Lilith, and a whole bunch of other religious inspirations, it's pretty clear that Oda wants us to understand that One Piece has its roots in religion. So I'm nearly certain that all of the pentagram visuals that Oda has shown is essentially taking inspiration from something in real life known as the Sigil of Baphomet. And before I jump into it and before I explain, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are kind of scared and worried, but you could trust me, I promise I'm not going to show any crazy imagery or any too wild of an explanation. I'm only going to go into this so we can make a theory and better understand One Piece. Now, when it comes to the sigil of Baphomet in real life, sigils are known to be occult symbols used in the practice of witchcraft and black magic, where magicians summon spirits and demons from the underworld. So it's basically a symbol that's used for what the average person would consider as dark and evil, and that's pretty much the short way of explaining it. Now, if we bounce back to Namakura Island, the location that Brook landed on when Kuma sent him flying, we can see that the residents of the island are wearing satanic cult-like clothing. From the black robes to the goats on their head, it's pretty obvious Oda's connecting the two concepts here. But the residents of Namakura Island also mentioned that they were doing black magic to summon our favorite skeleton, Brook, which explains why they were all worshipping a gigantic sigil on the ground in the first place, connecting to the sigil of Baphomet in the real world. Additionally, we know that during Fishman Island, Brook told us that his soul energy gives victims the chill of the underworld. That dialogue Brook gave us connects to sigils and the sigil of Baphomet yet again, because remember, I mentioned that it has a lot to do with the underworld. I find it very ironic how the same character that landed in the middle of a sigil and was called Satan is the same character that's talking about creating chills of the underworld. Like, the inspiration here feels so obvious. Anyways, let's divert our attention to chapter 1094, because recent events on Egghead further prove this religious and occult symbolism. We saw that Saint Saturn of the Gorosei spawned and crawled through the sigil of his own, yet again connecting to sigils in real life. And when he did that, he had Marines question if Saturn was using black magic, also a reference to sigils. With all of that explained, you're probably wondering what's the point of all this occult-like imagery and sigils and whatnot. I have the answer for you. As we said earlier, Imu most likely took the D-Clan crest and altered it so it matches him in the Gorosei. He basically inverted it for his own power and purposes. But I would even go as far as to say that when it comes to the Navaratna we mentioned earlier, we are yet again watching Imu taking something and inverting it. The star in the center is the inverted pentagram, symbolic of Baphomet or Satan, which is represented by Imu. Imu is the king of the demons, the physical manifestation of true evil. Imu is the devil. In the wise words of Charles Baudelaire, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. This infamous quote is a double entendre because it plays into two opposite characters at the same time. Imu paints the D-Clan as enemy of the gods, which is essentially painting someone like Nika or Joy Boy as a demon or devil, because that's the ultimate enemy of God. We also know that Imu and the Gorosei extinguished the light of Joy Boy and Nika, which would mean that Imu convinced the world that devil Nika never existed. But in contrast, we know that the Gorosei are based on monsters and demons, so we can ascertain that their leader Imu is a demon or devil himself. With Imu hiding in the shadows and being completely unknown to the world, he's basically convincing the world that he doesn't exist. The devil in the One Piece world doesn't exist in their eyes. And I don't know if you guys ever seen Oda's office before, but there are so many books and documents all over the place, it's literally a madhouse. We also see what feels like an infinite amount of literary references come from Oda, and it's all throughout One Piece. So I'm willing to bet any amount of money that Oda knows about this infamous quote and he's using it for the final boss of One Piece, Imu. Now, earlier we did talk a lot about Saint Saturn and the sapphire scales disease, and we kind of connected the two, but since we're on the topic of black magic, we can actually look into that to further prove that Saturn's connected to the sapphire scales disease. Because in real life, alchemists sought to harness legendary powers of sapphires. They were also the favorite stones of necromancers, which are basically black magicians, who employed them to summon spirits of the dead for prophecy and black magic. So basically, this is yet again another reason that Saturn and the Gorosei are connected to Ginny's sapphire scales disease, because of black magic and sigils that they are constantly using. Like, even Saturn's yokai form has a close resemblance to a black magician with demonic and satanic elements too, yet again connecting the Gorosei to the sigil of Baphomet. But let's not go too far off topic. Let's again pinpoint the connection between Saturn and the sapphire scales disease. One idea that comes to my mind is that the Gorosei might be using sapphire stones to summon their yokai forms, which would explain why Saturn said, "Ah, the surface, it's been such a long time." We know the One Piece world uses slaves throughout the story, whether it's for their own pleasure or if it's for their working purposes. Just think of Tequila Wolf. They sent slaves there to work for centuries just for nothing to come of it. Or think about the slaves that live under Marijwa pushing the travelators day in and day out. Like, I could imagine a scenario where the Gorosei have a sapphire mine somewhere, maybe inside of the Red Line, and they sent Ginny there to mine the minerals. This would essentially be a parallel to Law in his childhood, because we know that the residents of Flevence caught the amber lead disease by mining minerals underground in the first place. And as it turns out, white lead is a type of real mineral similar to sapphire, and it caused the disease that killed the people of Flevence just like the sapphire scales disease. So if this theory is true, it basically explains how Ginny caught the sapphire scales disease in the first place. But not only that, it also uses the alchemist lore we were talking about a moment ago to bridge a gap between Saturn and sapphires. Moving on, we know that Ginny told the Revs, "I finally made it back to the surface," which was the same thing that Saturn said after he came out of the ground. After Ginny said that, it was revealed she had blue crystal-like scales all over her body since she exposed herself to the sun. That implies that she was not in the sun when she caught the disease in the first place. So it makes a lot of sense that just like the amber lead syndrome, it's caused by miners underground trying to gather a mineral source. So now when we reflect, Oda used Law's backstory to foreshadow the idea of mining minerals that led to a disease, which will play into the sapphire scales disease. Also, I highly doubt that Bonnie's gonna be the only living character with the sapphire scales disease. One character that comes to everyone's mind is Emu. More than likely, Emu too has a sapphire scales disease. Like, think about it. The closest to the outside world Emu has ever visited was the flower garden, which doesn't even count as being outside, because we learned from King Neptune of Fishman Island that Sunlight Tree Eve produces artificial light, meaning fake sunlight. And that fake sunlight climbs a tree from Fishman Island all the way to the top of the red line where Marijwa is, reaching the flower garden that Emu visits. Now, this makes a lot of sense from a symbolic or metaphorical standpoint too, because remember, the sapphire scales disease kills people who are out in the sun. If Emu were to have this disease, it's beautifully symbolic to his hatred of the sun and sun god Nika, which essentially amplifies the fight between Luffy and Emu at the end of the story. And even beyond that, it ties into the Gorosei trying to extinguish a light, because from all different metaphorical angles, Emu hates the sun and hates the sunlight. As far as Emu having the sapphire scales disease goes though, I do think that he had the immortality operation done on him to kind of bypass it. Like, I highly doubt that Emu is like the 75th grandson of the dude that caused the Void Century in the first place for a few reasons. For one, Ivankov and Cobra said that the name Narona Emu sounds familiar because of someone who gathered 20 kingdoms to overthrow the ancient kingdom in the long past. Two, we know that the immortality operation is basically a Chekhov's gun, which means it's a plot device in a storyline that the author is going to use and reference at some point. That's exactly why Ivankov theorized that Emu might have the operation done on them in the past. It's Oda essentially confirming a very obvious conclusion. And finally, Luffy's always fighting the big bad that terrorizes the world, or at least they're part of it. Arlong harmed Kokoyashi village and Luffy defeated him. Crocodile harmed Alabasta and Luffy defeated him. Kaido harmed Wano and Luffy defeated him. The list goes on and on and on. So for the finale of One Piece, it makes most sense that Luffy would fight the man who caused destruction and genocide to the world, Emu, because he had the immortality operation done on him. And when I say him, I'm talking about Emu. Like, it's pretty clear that Emu is a man. And in order to really understand this and get the full scope of Emu's gender, we actually have to look at the origin of One Piece, which is a Japanese manga, not English. In Japanese, Emu uses the sentence end particle zo when he speaks, which is a masculine and commanding way to speak. Also in Japanese, Emu is called Emu-sei, which is exclusively used for men, not women. That's why we see female celestial dragons referred to as gu, which is exclusively for women, not men. And then finally, in English, they pretty much refer to Emu as king of the world, not queen of the world. So with all of these reasons, I can't be bothered to argue that Emu is a woman just because of an all-black silhouette. It's very apparent that Emu is a male demonic king with the sapphire scales disease that was jealous of sun god Nika, just like how Satan was jealous of the son of God in the Bible. Alright, since we talked a lot about Emu's character and this potential disease he might have, let's actually look at what mineral he aligns with in the Navaratna. Out of that group of minerals, we know that one of them, the pearl, is essentially connected to the moon. I would argue out of any celestial body that Emu's based on, it would be the moon of Earth specifically, so let's dive into why that's the case. Earlier we mentioned how the Navaratna has gems that are connected connected to specific planets and days of the week, and the moon is known for being connected to Monday. Now in the One Piece world, everyone from the ancient kingdom hates Imu, and that connects to how everyone in real life hates Mondays. Alright, I'm just joking, I'm just kidding with that one, but it does make a lot of sense that Imu's connected to the moon and the pearl, because that's literally the only celestial body that's not being taken by a Gorosei member or an ancient weapon. And if we turn our attention to NL's cover story, we know that after he lost to Luffy, he ended up visiting the moon and finding some pretty wild stuff up there. And that includes the hieroglyphics that talk about a story of people who lacked natural resources flew down to the blue planet. They essentially left their civilization up there with advanced technology that NL added to his arsenal. I think that group of people was led by Imu specifically, which ties to his family name of Navarathna. It's pretty obvious that Navarathna connects to the Japanese yokai Nore-onna and then Nero from Rome, but I don't want to get off topic with this video, because I think Navarathna plays off of the phrase corona, which is the effect that our eyeballs see when the moon shoots off several rays of light from the moon. That effect is the same design as Imu's eyes, which has to mean something given how intricate and detailed Oda makes his foreshadowing. Also, just in general, Imu being symbolism of the moon is a beautiful contrast between him and sun god Nika. Because I know in certain intros of the anime, there's an animation of the moon going in front of the sun, which is extinguishing the light of the sun, causing an eclipse on the world. So if Imu is the celestial body of the moon, then that would mean that Imu is connected to the mineral of a pearl specifically. And if you ask me, I enjoyed Pokemon Ruby more than Pokemon Pearl, but definitely not as much as Pokemon Emerald. So that means I have to shout out Saint Mercury of the Gorosei, because his mineral's the emerald, remember? Alright, no more trolling, last time I promise, but if you guys want me to make like a full compilation video about why Imu is the moon god, leave it down in the comments and maybe I'll work on it. But let's actually shift our focus once again to the Navaratna, as we mentioned earlier that Venus aligns with the diamond. I suspect that this foreshadows Gorosei Venus's future fight that'll happen later in the story, and I suspect it's with our favorite swordsman, Zoro. Because in Alabasta, when Zoro was fighting Mr. One, he mentioned how he needs to learn how to cut anything and nothing. But more importantly, that includes diamond, which is the true mineral of the planet of Venus. Do you guys think that Gorosei Venus is gonna have some type of ability, defense, or power having something to do with diamonds? If you guys know any evidences or foreshadowing to that, please comment down below, I'm curious. The symbols of Alabasta, Skypiea, Fishman Island, and Wano are all interconnected to the true symbol of the ancient kingdom. Oda being inspired by real-life religion is the reason why he took the Navaratna from Hinduism and implemented it into the D-clan crest. This was then inverted by Imu to create the world government symbol, and also the pentagrams that the Gorosei love to be seen with. The king of the demons, Imu, extinguished the light of the sun, forcing the One Piece world into a geocentric model. But with the rise of sun god Nika, the truth will come to light, shifting the One Piece planet into a heliocentric model. This will inevitably anger Imu, an evil pearl king hiding from the sun due to his jealousy and sapphire scales disease. But he's really gonna have to pay when Joy Boy, aka sun god Luffy, finally confronts him in the middle of Marijois.